Hi everyone, this is Leia with Headwaters, and today we have a very special Lunch with the Scientists presentation for Tahoe Expedition Academy, featuring 3 scientists from the Tahoe area. We've got Mary Patterson, Carrie Johnson, and Emily Enochs. They're all biologists from the Forest Service. We're going to hear from all 3 of them and get to ask them some questions in just a minute. So these 3 women are biologists with the Forest Service. One of their primary jobs is to provide project input during the planning phase to ensure that they are not jeopardizing populations of Tahoe's sensitive species. They do this by completing pre-project surveys to inventory rare species and invasive species. Carrie is an aquatic biologist and is in charge of fish and frogs. Emily is a terrestrial wildlife biologist who does surveys primarily of owls, goshawks, and eagles. And Mary is a botanist and is in charge of rare plants and invasive plants. So I am really pleased to introduce our first speaker, Carrie.
So hi, everyone. Thanks for inviting us here today. I'm Carrie Johnson. I'm the aquatics and fisheries biologist for Tahoe National Forest. 1 second. Do you know how to make it just me? Click that one. Oh, but then I'm not on there, but that's okay. All right. Okay, sorry, technical issues. So I was just going to explain today a little of what I do when we do aquatic surveys on our forest locally here in the Truckee area. And we're mainly looking for frogs and fish and working to protect them. So this is a map of where we do our work. It's the Tahoe National Forest. And we work in the Truckee and Sierraville districts here on the east side. And we work basically in any kind of water, ponds, lakes, streams, wetlands, meadows. And a few of these photos, you'll see people in them. So this is our crew doing some survey work in ponds, marshy areas, and along streams. Anywhere there's water, you'll find amphibians. And that's what we're looking for, and fish too. Before we get to the frogs, I just want to explain a little bit about the Endangered Species Act, because our main focus is to survey for sensitive and endangered species on our forests. I don't know if you guys have heard this, you probably have, but if you're not familiar with it, it became a law in 1973 to help protect species in danger of extinction. It's administered by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, which is another federal agency, just as we are. The Forest Service is a federal agency. The Fish and Wildlife Service handles all freshwater fish and all other species. And then the National Marine Fisheries Service handles all the marine species under the Endangered Species Act. And so we work closely with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service to make sure we work to protect these critical endangered species or sensitive species, threatened species. The Fish and Wildlife Service mission is to work with others to conserve, protect, and enhance fish, wildlife, and plants and their habitats. And then the Forest Service, that's us, provides the scientific and technical knowledge necessary to protect and sustain the nation's natural resources on all lands. And we also have the challenge of managing the land for multiple uses. So we strive to protect the species, but then we also have to consider people's use of the land, such as recreation and fire problems with the potential fire zones, thinning the forests, that kind of thing. So the Endangered Species Act is basically separated into different listing status categories, and I have them listed here. So there can be a candidate species, which is under consideration for official listing. And an example of this is on the picture on the left here is a white bark pine, which was once a candidate species, and now it's proposed threatened. And this is a species that Mary's going to talk about later, our botanist, on our forest. Threatened means it's likely to become endangered. We also have an endangered species on our forest in danger of extinction, and that's the yellow-legged frog. So that's one that's important on our forest. Another category is extinct, and that's when no individuals of a species remain, and that's what we strive to avoid. So hopefully by our surveying and efforts to help protect these species, we can prevent them from going extinct. Species can also be delisted, which means they can be removed from the list due to successful recovery efforts. And an example in our area is the bald eagle. It was once an endangered species, and due to successful recovery efforts, it's now been delisted. There's also critical habitat, which is an important aspect of the Endangered Species Act, and that's designated for any listed species. And I'll talk about that later when I go over some frog information. At the Forest Service level where we work, we also deal with sensitive species, and those are species in which population viability is a concern, which basically means we're worried if their population numbers are decreasing. And Emily will be talking about that later in her talk. She deals with the California spotted owl, which is the picture on the right here, and that's one of our forest sensitive species. So back to frogs. We have 4 Sierra Nevada frog species found in our area, and these are them. We have the California toad. This is distinguished by the white stripe on its back and kind of the warty toad-like appearance and the webbed hind feet. It's a native species. We have the Sierra tree frog or Pacific chorus frog, and you guys might have seen these around. They're pretty common, and you definitely might have heard these around. This is what they sound like. I love how they sound. So for such a small frog, they only get like no bigger than the size of a silver dollar. They make a really loud sound. And they're really distinguished by this black eye stripe here. We also have the Sierra Nevada yellow-legged frog, and this is our endangered species. It's found in higher elevation lakes and streams and pretty uncommon. And I'll kind of go over why that is in the next few slides. And then occasionally around here, you might come across a bullfrog, which is bad news. These are not native to our area. They're native to the East Coast, but they've been moved out here. And the problem with bullfrogs is they will eat everything and anything in sight. And so they will eat all these other species of frogs. They will take over the habitat and the resources. If you guys are interested in learning more about different frogs and reptiles, this website down here, California Herps, is one of the best websites I've come across. And you can learn about any kind of frog or reptile in there. So the Sierra Nevada yellow-legged frog is our main species we work on because it is the only federally endangered animal species on our forest. It was listed on the list in 2014. You can see yellow legs, that's why it got its name. This is Emily holding a yellow-legged frog up near Donner Summit, where we have a population. It's endangered because of non-native fish stocking. Back in the 1800s, California Fish and Wildlife and through the 1900s have stocked fish mainly for recreation fishermen who enjoy fishing. But a lot of those lakes that were stocked never had fish in the past. They had frogs. So once the fish are introduced, the fish eat frogs. There's also the chytrid fungus, which is a fungus that's worldwide, spreading and affecting virtually every amphibian. And there's still a lot of research going on that, on how to control it and what to do about it, but it will kill off populations of frogs. They're also endangered due to pesticides, chemicals, pollution, and waterways. Livestock grazing, if cattle are in ponded areas and there's, it's a dry year, there's not that much water, the cattle are drinking water or trampling tadpoles, there's issues there. There's recreation issues, motorcycles going through streams or ponds, that kind of thing. There's water diversion issues, which creates loss of habitat, so damming of waterways. And And then climate change, of course, which seems to affect everything nowadays. We're concerned about this with frogs due to drying of breeding areas. So just to show you where yellow-legged frogs are, here's a range map. And there's 2 species. So down south, down near Kings Canyon, below Yosemite, we have Rana muscosa, is the southern mountain yellow-legged frog. And then this red-orange area is the range for our species, Rana sierrae. And this is just a range map. That doesn't mean they're throughout this whole area. So they're located in pockets throughout this range map. And then this map here is federally designated critical habitat. So how I was talking about with the Endangered Species Act, there's also critical habitat designated. This shows you where my cursor is, if you can see it, is Truckee, where the roads all come together here. And so we have a big plot of critical habitat pretty close to us up on Donner Summit in that area. So that's an important area for protecting these frogs. So all frogs have the same life cycle. Once the snow starts melting, the adult frogs will get together and breed and produce these egg masses, which they attach to vegetation, rocks, logs. These eggs will hatch after about 3 weeks into tadpoles. And with Sierra Nevada yellow-legged frog, these tadpoles need at least 2 to 4 years before they change into subadults. And the term we use for that is metamorphosis. So they need that long to metamorphose into a subadult. And then once it becomes a subadult here, it needs at least 3 to 4 years to become an adult, which is the designation for being reproductively mature, where they can breed and have more frogs of their own. So it comes down to the fact that they need to be at least 5 years old to produce more frogs. In the literature I've read that they found to live to 16 years. So they're kind of long-lived for a frog. And I just like this picture on the right here because it shows 3 different life stages. We have the tadpole, the subadult, and the adult. Pretty cool. Some of the other differences between the endangered Sierra Nevada yellow-legged frog versus our tree frogs and toads that are found locally are on this slide. And this is part of the reason why yellow-legged frogs are endangered. Yellow-legged frogs are always found in or near water, whereas our tree frogs and toads are often found on dry land away from water. Yellow-legged frogs need ponds or streams that have non-freezing water year-round and are deep enough for the tadpoles and adults to overwinter, whereas tree frogs and toads only need water for the reproductive phases. The adults can actually live away from water and they can overwinter in dry burrows. Yellow-legged frog tadpoles need 2 to 4 years to metamorphose into subadults, like I talked about already, whereas tree frogs and toads can change from larva to adult within 1 season. And yellow-legged frogs take 5 to 8 years in total to be able to reproduce and create more frogs, whereas tree frogs and toads only take 1 to 2 years to become reproductively mature. So some major differences between the species, and that warrants why Sierra Nevada yellow-legged frogs are on the endangered species list, along with the threats posed to them. And some of these threats we'll go over again in more detail here. The chytrid fungus, we have pictures on the right here. It's called BD, I'm not going to try and pronounce that, but BD for short. It attacks the keratin and skin. And since frogs use skin to breathe, it affects their respiration and also affects their nervous system. So the picture on the right shows what it can do to a frog's skin, and then there's sometimes massive die-offs of these frogs. We do have BD in our systems locally, but we haven't come across any massive die-offs yet. So there's still a lot of research going on how to control this fungus in the frog population. Another threat is the fish stocking. Like I talked about before, fish are being put and have been being put into ponds that were once fishless. They only contained frogs. So now once the fish are introduced, the fish eat egg masses, tadpole and metamorph stages of frogs, and the reproductive life stages can never mature. And then climate change, in particular, we're concerned about warming temperatures and less precipitation. With yellow-legged frogs, if a body of water used for breeding dries up for just one season, up to 4 generations of tadpoles may be destroyed. There's also natural predators of frogs, such as this garter snake, which was found eating a frog on Donner Summit during one of our surveys a couple years ago. And then birds will eat frogs too. And the one exception is bullfrogs will actually eat birds, rodents, other frogs. They will eat anything they can get their mouth around, which is why they're so harmful to our natural native animals. So for us at the Forest Service, there's some conservation measures that we take for trying to preserve and conserve the yellow-legged frog. We monitor the populations on our forests. That we do this by conducting visual encounter surveys, which means we basically walk around looking for frogs. So it's a pretty fun job. I love it. Once we see a frog, we try and capture them with nets or by hand. And we take measurements and we try to sex them if they're male or female. This middle slide shows a male, and you can tell because of this little pad on his thumb. It's called a nuptial pad used for breeding. So once they're adults, we can tell whether they're male or female. So we get as much information on them as we can. We also do some testing for the chytrid fungus. This picture on the right shows me swabbing a frog a couple years ago. You swab the skin of the frog, send it into a lab, and they analyze and determine whether that frog has the chytrid fungus or not. And then we're also going to be utilizing what's called eDNA sampling. Any living creature excretes DNA in some form from their skin cells or whatever into a natural system. So we can use a pump to filter water and capture that eDNA on a filter, which is then sent to a lab, and it will tell us what species is in that waterway. It's pretty cool, evolving technology. We also consult regularly with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service when yellow-legged frogs are found in any project area. That way we keep an eye on what's going on with this endangered species. Other forests have been removing non-native fish with gill nets. So in certain lakes where they have an already kind of set frog population, or there's a fish barrier below to where fish can't move up and down, and they determine a lake might be a good candidate for frog reintroduction, they can remove and kill the fish that are in there, which are actually not all non-native fish anyways, and then reintroduce captive reared frogs from a zoo or translocate wild frogs into that pond and try to get that population going again. So that's happening in the Desolation Wilderness, down by Yosemite. There's all kinds of projects going on like that. We also try to improve the habitat and improve the connectivity by decommissioning trails in sensitive habitats. And we also are really it's important to decontaminate our footwear and our gear between waterways. So we clean and bleach footwear and gear if we're moving between different watersheds. So we don't want to spread that chytrid fungus, which will get on your shoes and can be transported. And we also create educational signs, such as this little picture here. This is a new sign on Donner Summit that we got up last year in a frog area. So those are our measures for trying to conserve this species. There's other cool amphibian species in our area, the southern long-toed salamander. And it goes through different metamorphoses also, from the larval stage with external gills here in this top picture, metamorphosizing into the adults. And the Sierra newt is also very similar to a salamander. And we find those occasionally during our surveys. Neither of those are endangered, but the southern long-toed salamander is a species of concern for the state of California. So we like to keep an eye on those also. And now we'll switch gears to fish. So we only have one native trout in our area. That's the Lahan and cutthroat trout. And it's identified primarily by this red jawline here on the right side. And it is the only federally threatened animal species on our forest, listed in 1970. It's threatened because of non-native fish introductions. So rainbow trout, brown trout, brook trout, lake trout are all non-native species that have outcompeted, and they prey upon LCT, Lahanan cutthroat trout. In addition, rainbow trout will hybridize with LCT, and so that reduces the pure genetic strain of LCT. There's also landscape changes associated with development, mining, timber harvest, road and railroad building, dams, pollution, and commercial fishing. So there's a lot of threats to the cutthroat trout. And as of now, there's mainly isolated populations of LCT in certain areas. So it's limited by this fragmentation, and there's a loss of the genetic variability since it can't move around to spread its genes. And these are our non-native trout species. So there's many competitors for LCT, which is why it's really hard to get LCT back in large numbers. And you may have heard of some of these kinds of trout. They're all very common in our area, and there's no way to get rid of a lot of these because they're so prevalent. Brook trout, brown trout, rainbow trout, kokanee salmon, and lake trout are actually all non-native species of fish in our area. But there are some native species, and these are the species that evolved with Lahanan cutthroat trout eons ago before the non-natives were introduced. So this is the mountain whitefish. We have Paiute sculpin. We have some little minnow type fish, Lahanan red-side shiners, speckled dace, and Tahoe and mountain suckers, and the tui chub. These are all native fish on our forest. So restoring Lahanan cutthroat trout populations, there's work being done to remove non-native trout in certain areas where there's a fish barrier so that the Lahanan cutthroat trout populations can increase. And CDFW, which is California Department of Fish and Wildlife, they're responsible for fish stocking across the state. They're reducing some of that fish stocking in certain areas. They also work on raising hatchery raised LCT, which are stocked into several lakes in our area. And that's just kind of a hopes to maintain the population numbers. We also work to improve LCT habitat, which involves increasing woody debris in streams, restoring bank vegetation to help shade and decrease water temperatures, repair stream sediment issues from bank and road erosion, and improve fish culverts so they can get through and move. And then land exchanges can also secure important LCT habitat, and collaborating with private landowners are some ways that we can try and help restore LCT. All right, are you guys ready for a quiz? I'm going to give you a minute here to see if you're paying attention to identify these frogs. And for your bonus, which one is the endangered species? You have 1 minute. Go.
Carrie, are you able to see the video of the people watching? Or are you full screen right now?
I have a video of the classroom.
Great. So we got some hands raised, so I'll let you handle that in about a minute.
Okay, sounds good. Oh man, there's lots of hands. All right, your minute's up. I'm going to the next screen so you can see what you got right or didn't. You guys probably got them all right.
Do you want to let them guess, Carrie?
Oh. Yeah, I just can't hear anyone, but
Michaela will let you designate a speaker.
Okay, how about for number 1 here?
American bullfrog.
Right on. And what's wrong with bullfrogs?
They eat literally everything.
They're non-native.
They eat everything. They're big bags.
And they're non-native.
Perfect. Excellent job. Yes, you guys got it right. That is perfect. How about number 2?
Tree frog.
Tree frog.
You got it. Those are the ones that make the cool sound that we hear around here all the time, the croaking. You guys have heard those, right?
Yeah.
How about number 3? Wait, what was that?
The yellow leg speckled frog thing. It's endangered.
It is endangered. Good job. That is our endangered frog. It's the Sierra Nevada yellow-legged frog. Good job. How about number 4?
California toad.
Perfect. You got it. Those guys kind of get like this size, really fat and chubby and cute. They're pretty cool. Sometimes you'll see them on dry land just hopping across roads. Great job, you guys. I think that's all I got. So questions, I'm ready for them.
Why are frogs so happy to eat whatever bug?
So Michaela, if you want to just kind of help designate the people who are raising their hands in class, we may need them to get a little closer to the microphone. Go for it.
So you said the LCT. You said the LCT was like, maybe I misheard, but I thought I heard you said the LCT was the only native trout, but then you listed like a bunch of other trout, like the brook trout. No, oh, they're not trout. Okay.
Yeah. All the other trout species are non-native, but those other fish species that weren't trout are natives. So the only trout that's native is the Lahan and cutthroat trout in our area.
So go ahead, Angus.
Why are amphibians and fish important?
Amphibians and fish are important. They're part of our food chain, the ecosystem. So amphibians in particular eat a lot of, well, fish also eat a lot of insects. That's their main prey. So they serve as that intermediate stage between trophic levels, which are food levels. And a lot of things can eat frogs and fish too. So they're that intermediary stage that's really important for other species.
Jackson?
So do you know, do you know how BD got transmitted to frogs or amphibians? Like, is it from like a different country and it got led into the watershed?
Yeah, it is from a different country. I think it's from Australia originally. And just from how it attaches to people's footwear or any kind of gear so easily, that gets spread rampantly. You know, most people don't think about that when they walk between waterways or if you're traveling between countries in some way. I think a major reason it spread though is the pet trade. People catching wild frogs and then they get shipped overseas to a different country. The frog has this fungus that was native to Australia, let's say, but it gets shipped to the United States. And then all of a sudden, it's in our system here. If someone sets that frog free, which a lot of people do, they set non-native species out into the wild, then BD is introduced into our native systems. So there's a lot that we don't know about it, but it has spread really rampantly. And it affects different species of frogs differently too. So with yellow-legged frog, it tends to take hold pretty hard, but there's other species, I don't know what they are offhand, where it doesn't affect them as much. So there's a lot to learn still about it.
Where do the other trout that you mentioned come from? Like the brown trout and the river trout?
I couldn't hear your question.
where do the other trout that you mentioned, where do they come from? Like the brown trout and the rainbow trout?
Yeah, so I'm not sure about rainbows, but I know brown and brook trout were originally from the East Coast. And I think they were just introduced into the Western areas because fishing is such a popular recreational activity for so many people. And especially, 100 years ago when there wasn't a lot of thought about conservation or natural ecosystems, people just, they wanted to fish, they wanted to have a source of food. So they would stock these lakes with fish that they were used to on the East Coast that they thought would do well. I definitely know brown and brook trout. I'm not sure of the other species exactly where they're from.
When were bullfrogs introduced this year in Nevada?
So that question was, when were bullfrogs introduced to this year in Nevada?
That's a good question. I don't know if anyone knows for sure, like exactly when. It's the same thing. People will catch frogs and keep them as pets and then move out west and release them. So, all of this has to do with humans being that hand where we mess with the system sometimes, and this is what happens. So unfortunately, I don't have an answer for you as to like when exactly they were found here, where they were first found here. We don't have we haven't detected a lot of bullfrogs in our forest, which is great. So hopefully we won't still. In the Sierraville range where there's lower elevation, there is a population in a pond. Like Lake Tahoe on the South Shore, they have a population of bullfrogs that they're trying to get rid of. So, unfortunately, when people see a bullfrog locally, we want to get rid of it by killing it because they're so harmful to all of our native frogs. So it's not the funnest thing to have to do. So I just hope that we won't be finding too many in our local Truckee area. So far, so good.
Michaela, do we want to do one, maybe two more questions? And if anyone watching online has a question, please feel free. All right, well, thank you very much. Oh, is there another one?
Thank you, guys. I hope you learned something and look for frogs.
Oh, it looks like we might have, oh, okay. All right, thank you very much, Carrie. Okay, so
I'm handing it over to Emily now.
that's great. Yeah, so we are going to welcome Carrie. Just a reminder, Emily is a terrestrial wildlife biologist, primarily working on birds. So Carrie, you can feel free to take it away.
Hi, everyone. Yeah, my name's Emily. I'm the crew leader for the wildlife crew here in Tahoe National Forest on the Truckee District. I was going to talk to you today about some of the wildlife we have here on the forest and some unique ones that we have here. So usually when people think of terrestrial wildlife, they think of the big, large mammals, and you've probably seen these around town, in your backyard, in the forest. Well, you may not have seen a mountain lion, but they're definitely here. So we have mountain lions, bobcats, American black bears. There's no grizzly bears here. It's only black bears and mule deer. So a really unique species that we have here, well, we don't know if he's still here, is Buddy the wolverine. So up around the Sage Hen Experimental Forest, there was a sighting of Buddy. You can kind of see him over here. This is a hair snare where they put food up there and little nails to kind of catch fur. And it's kind of funny because here's a coyote watching him. So Buddy is the only known wolverine in California in 94 years. He was first detected in 2008. He was last documented in 2018. So we don't know the fate of Buddy. He could still be out there cruising around. But probably like 12 years old is about the full lifespan of a wolverine. So if he is alive, he's very old. Through genetic analysis, they found that he traveled from the Sawtooth Mountains in Idaho. They did this from using the hair from the hair snare and hair from some of the wolverines in Idaho. How do I close this? So I don't have to see this thing. It's kind of, or can I make it smaller so I can see my slides?
the left one, but then you can't see yourself.
Okay. So another relic species that we have are the American pika. They're small. They like to live in rocky alpine terrain above tree line on talus slopes. So you only find them at the very highest elevation around here. They're herbivores related to rabbits. To survive the winter, they live in dens where they've stored plants and then they eat them in the wintertime. The population is declining due to climate change. And this is a small species. They're only about 6 to 8 inches with a little round body, no tail, and little round ears. They're really adorable. If you ever hear them when you're up on the rocky slopes, it's kind of like a little like beep, beep noise. They're so cute. So the pika distribution, this is an older picture. It's from 1995. It's actually gotten smaller. I don't think we have them on Donner Pass or over at Marlette Lake. For the most part, their population is in the Granite Chief Wilderness and over on Mount Rose. So here is a bunch of birds that you may see around here. All of these species are considered sensitive by the Forest Service. We have an American bald eagle, a sandhill crane, northern goshawk, and willow flycatcher. So one of the species that we do the most work with is the California spotted owl. It's a subspecies. There's 2 other subspecies, the Mexican spotted owl and the northern spotted owl. And both of these subspecies are listed. The California spotted owl is not listed yet, but at some point it probably will be if it keeps in the direction it's going. So on this map, it'll kind of show you the range of the northern spotted owl, the California spotted owl. For the most part, you can see it's just right here in the Sierra Nevada with a few small populations along the coast. And then the Mexican spotted owl is through the American Southwest and down through Mexico. So spotted owls need mature old growth forests with multi-layer understories. They need a high canopy with coarse down woody debris. And they usually live in conifers, but they can also live in hardwood forests. So this is a photo of one of our birds here on our forest. So a California spotted owl is usually about the size, kind of between the size of a raven and a crow. So not a huge bird, but pretty large. They have totally dark eyes, kind of gives them a ghostly appearance. Their chest is brown and white spotted. It's kind of a mottled color, and that's one of the easiest ways to identify them. Along with barred feathered tails. They weigh between 500 to 700 grams, with the female being larger than the male, with a wingspan of about 100 centimeters. So if you're out hiking around in the woods at night and you hear this, you might be hearing a spotted owl. So that's their 4-note call. That's kind of their territorial call that you'll hear. And they're so cute. So for nesting, they like to live in snags. So you can see this is a female kind of creeping, looking around from the snag. They don't build nests like traditional birds with big amounts of sticks and moss and all of that. They pretty much use cavities exclusively. Down in Mexico, they do use some caves. So spotted owls, they mate for life. They usually lay between 1 to 4 eggs. Incubation period is 28 to 32 days. And the nestling period is 34 to 36 days. So the nestling period is just when they've already hatched, but they're still living in the nest. They can't fly yet. Here are some fledglings. So this is after they have left the nest. They come out kind of looking like little white fluff balls. This is a picture of me holding, I think this one's about 6 months old. So you can see it's starting to get adult flight feathers. And this bird can fly, where the little white bird, it still can't fly yet. It can just kind of hop around. So the California spotted owl has been seeing declining populations, mainly due to habitat fragmentation, habitat loss, and the arrival of the barred owl. So habitat fragmentation is just how, usually from human development or from fire, it's just where large patches of old growth forest have been separated, so there's no connectivity for them to fly to. This makes them a lot more vulnerable to predation, such as by larger raptors. So spotted owls can be preyed upon by northern goshawks or even other larger owls, such as great horned owls. The habitat fragmentation also reduces their food resources. So loss of habitat, this can also come from development where the forests are cut down or logged, which can also be for timber harvest, which can be selective or sometimes they clear cut in certain areas. We don't clear cut here on the Forest Service, but you'll see some areas where private land has been clear cut. There can also be due to large scale tree mortality due to drought, bark beetles, wildfire suppression, which leads to ultimately more extreme fires, which wipes out forests and canopies. Also climate change, longer, hotter summers, and longer fire seasons. So kind of a unique situation with the spotted owl is the arrival of the barred owl. The barred owl is an eastern species. It's in the same genus as a spotted owl. You can see they look very similar. The only difference that you can really tell visually is that they're larger and their chest, they have more of a barred chest instead of the spotted chest. They live in the same habitat as spotted owls, so they have to compete for those resources. They're larger and more aggressive, and they tend to outcompete a spotted owl. They can also hybridize in what's called a sparred owl. So this is the noise, the eight note call by barred owls. Hear that again. All right, so how did the barred owls get here? So they're an eastern species. So pretty much anywhere east of the Mississippi was native habitat for barred owls. They started expanding westward kind of as they followed settlers across the Great Plains through Canada. So this map kind of shows how that happened up into northern Canada, and they're slowly making their way down through the Pacific Northwest and into California. This is kind of an older map. They've actually made their way to just north of here. And over on the Yuba Ranger District, there have been some barred owls spotted. So according to the Fish and Wildlife, the most common theory is that the barred owls westward movement was caused by changes to the environment in the Great Plains as people increasingly settled there and dramatically altered the landscape. This may be from removal of natural barriers that previously inhibited the barred owl's westward expansion. So usually as people were expanding west, they were planting trees and just providing habitat for those owls to slowly move. So it took them a long time to get here, but they are definitely well established. So the U.S. Fish and Wildlife is partaking in the barred owl removal experiment. This is where they are going through and trying to remove barred owls to see if the spotted owl population will rebound. And preliminary results show that they are, but they still need more research to kind of figure out if that's going to work. So just some cool facts about all owls. So owls have acute hearing for nighttime hunting and navigation. They have a disc-shaped face that helps trap the sound and funnel the sounds to their ears. So it'd be kind of like if you walked around with your hands behind your ears all the time, listening, kind of using that as a satellite. Their ear holes are also asymmetrical. One is higher than the other. And this allows the owls to build a three-dimensional model of its surroundings because it can build it from, it's kind of hard to explain, but through the different timing that they receive a noise through each ear, it helps them build that model in their head. So also owls are silent flyers, and this is because of the comb-like structure on the edge of their, feathers, where most birds, when they fly, they have a more rigid wing. And so the air rushes to the edge and creates a gushing noise, where an owl doesn't have that. Like when they fly in, you can't hear them. Other cool facts, owls have extra vertebrae, which allow them to have additional mobility in their head. From this, you can see that they can flip their head upside down. They can turn 170 degrees. You can see this is the backside of an owl, and its face is pointing right at you. So give it a try. How much can you turn your head? And that's all I have. So I can take questions if anyone wants. If I can figure it out. All right, there. All right.
Yeah, go ahead, Michaela. Feel free to work with your students.
So when you're like out in the field, like trying to capture like sightings or whatever, like or trying like identify types of animals and birds, what if they're hurt? Like, do you have to leave them because like that makes like natural selection, or like can you help them?
We do leave them. Yeah, it's kind of like whatever nature's course takes, that's what happens. There are some other programs that we're not involved in where, you know, they do wildlife rehabilitation.
What is the spotted owl's lifespan?
Lifespan in captivity, they've lived up to like 25 years, but typically it's more like in just being a teenager.
Is there a certain place in Sierra Nevada where you guys find most of the spotted owls, or are they all over?
So we're kind of on the end of their habitat. Most of them are over on the western slope, but really it's anywhere between like 2,000 feet up to 7,000 feet.
How often do you think like crossbreeding between the barred owl and the spotted owl actually happens?
You know, they're still doing a lot of research on that. They're still trying to figure out what's happening with the barred owl and the spotted owl. I used to live in Southern Oregon and I saw a spotted owl once. So it's not super common, but it is happening. And we don't know if they're sterile and reproducing or what's happening yet.
Have you ever seen like a weird crossover between like two species or like two types of like species of an animal?
Well,
Like,
I mean,
yeah.
the barred owl and the spotted owl are an example, but typically no, that's very rare. And this only happens, you know, usually within animals within the same genus. So kind of like how Carrie was talking about with rainbow trout and LCT, they're in the same genus and they're able to hybridize, but it's not very common.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Any other questions?
All right, well, let's say thank you very much to Emily. Really appreciate it. And we're gonna bring on Mary Patterson.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
And just as a reminder, Mary Patterson is a botanist and she works with rare plants and invasive plants. So she'll tell you about that.
Yes, thank you. So I oversee the rare plant and invasive plant programs on the east half of the Tahoe National Forest. But today I'm gonna just focus my presentation on one rare plant that's in peril, which is the white bark pine. So we have a range map here of the white bark pine. It is a high elevation tree that grows in very exposed and harsh environments. So it's found mostly in its biggest part of its range is the northern Rocky Mountains. And then we have a small little population in the Sierra Nevada mountains. And then it's kind of pretty fragmented up through the Cascades. It is a keystone species of the subalpine forest, which means that a bunch of other animals and plants rely on this species. So without this species, those populations of those other plants and animals will also decline. It is, its federal status is proposed threatened, which means that the Fish and Wildlife Service is currently reviewing whether it warrants a formal status, like the LCT and the yellow-legged frog. And we should hear back within the year whether they give it a formal status. One really interesting thing about the white bark pine is that it has a symbiotic relationship with the Clark's nutcracker. And it's the cones of the white bark pine never open. So the only way that this tree can disperse its population is through the Clark's nutcracker. And in return, the Clark's nutcracker use it as a food source. So quick, I'm going to go over some identification traits of this species. It's found at or near tree line. It has indehiscent cones, which means that they stay closed at maturity. And the cones, it takes a tree 20 to 30 years of age before it can first produce a cone. And the bark is described as kind of being a cornflake texture. So here's a picture of the tree at tree line. If you've been out hiking, kind of seeing how a tree will often only grow on one side of the tree, because that's that super harsh environment that it's exposed to. So it creates a flagging or crumholes shape, which is a fancy word for that kind of growth structure. White bark pine also typically has multiple boles or trunks. So you can see here that there's, 6 or 7 trunks coming out of this one tree, kind of like an octopus. It has a couple different lookalikes in our area. Super sensitive. So white bark pine is over here. It is a 5-needled pine tree. So you can kind of see in this picture, there's 5 needles for each clump. Western white pine is also a 5-needle pine. And then lodgepole pine is a 2-needled pine. You can see in this clump, there's only 2 needles per clump. And one kind of distinguishing factor between the white bark pine and the Western white pine is that these needles are a little bit thicker, a little bit coarser. The Western white pine needles are a little bit thinner, a little bit more limber. The barks of the trees, you can see white bark pine and lodgepole pine both have this corn flaky texture. And then Western white pine has this more checkered, I describe it as alligator skin. And then the surefire way to identify a tree is through their cone. But like I said, it takes 20 to 30 years before a tree a white bark pine can produce its cones. You can see that this cone is still closed. It stays closed at maturity. The only way to open it is through the Clark's nutcracker. Western white pines have a little bit longer cones, and then lodgepole pines are small, kind of golf ball size. So you can see all those characteristics together. So threats to this species, there's a number of different threats. Climate change is a threat, like so many species. As a result, pine beetles, which is a native pest, are moving to higher elevations, and where pine beetles didn't used to attack white bark pine, they're now attacking white bark pines. And then the suitable habitat for white bark pines is also getting pushed upward. And if you saw from the picture before, they grow on the ridge tops and the tops of the mountains. So with that habitat being pushed upward, there's nowhere for those plants to move when they're on the top of the mountains. Another threat is fire suppression. So white bark pine needs openings for regeneration. And through years and years of fire suppression, other trees like lodgepole pine are making their way into those openings. And so there's no habitat for the whitebark pine to regenerate. Another threat, especially kind of in our area, is human infrastructure. So power lines and ski resorts, they don't want trees that interfering with their infrastructure. So they'll cut down trees no matter what type of plant, what type of tree species it is, if it's in threat of their infrastructure. And then the last thing that I'm going to really focus on is white pine blister rust. And this is an invasive species that is native to Asia, and it was introduced to British Columbia in the 1900s through tree saplings. And this is a range map of the white pine blister rust in California. It was introduced to British Columbia, so as you would kind of expect, it's moving its way south. So the red dots on this map are areas where it's been detected, and it's moving its way south. White pine blister rust only attacks pines that are in the 5-needle family. So that would be the western white pine, which I already showed a picture of, and the sugar pine, and then the whitebark pine. And the pine trees are its primary host, but it also has a secondary host of ribes species. So how that works is that it has an infected host. It creates cankers, which is the fruiting body of the rust of the fungus. And then the fruiting bodies release spores that then go to the ribes species, and they create an orange kind of coating that then gets airborne back to the pine needles. So in our area, we have a number of different ribes species, but here's just 2 examples. The alpine prickly currant and then the wax currant. So ways to tell if white pine blister rust is on a tree is first it's gonna infect the needles of the tree. So you'll have needle die off. And then the fungus will travel to the stems and the trunk and produce these fruiting bodies. And then on the secondary host, you'll see it by seeing this rusty kind of powdery coating on the leaves. So now, quick little activity. I think if you guys don't already have this handout, you can pass it out. But what I want you to do is on this handout, I want you to circle the areas of the trees that show the signs of the blister rust. So we'll give you some time to look at those photos and see if you can identify the blister rust on these trees. All right, do we have a volunteer that wants to tell us what they see on this first photo? So on this first photo, we have some dying needles. So that's the first area where the rust infects the tree. And then it's also starting to create a canker right at this where the branch meets the trunk. All right, what about this moving right, the second photo?
So in the is that the top right?
Top right, yeah.
So the pine needles are dying.
Yeah, pine needles are dying. All right, middle left.
It's the weird like canker sore.
Yeah,
On the tree next to the trunk thing.
yeah. So the sap of a tree is its natural defense system. So we see a big blob of sap right here. So it's the tree is trying to heal itself from the infection. All right, middle right. Yeah.
I'm guessing that really big blob.
Yep, really big blob. And this reddy orange outline is characteristic of the blister rust, pine blister rust. Bottom left.
The little larva looking things.
Yeah, so these are called cankers. And a canker is the fruiting body of a fungus. And so these kind of look like blisters, which is where this fungus gets its name, white pine blister rust. And then final photo.
The dead trees.
It is a dead tree. So once the cankers infect the trunk of the tree, it will slowly girdle it and it will just leave a dead tree behind. All right, so how can we help this species? One of the first things we have to do in order to protect a species is we have to know where the species is, where the tree is. This is something that everyone can help with, no matter if you're a Forest Service employee or a student. You can use iNaturalist, which is an app, and you can take photos of trees if you believe that they're a white bark pine. And back in my identification slides, if you'll remember, there's a couple of trees that look really similar to it. So if you're going to make an observation, it's really important that we have multiple photos of the tree so we can see the bark, the needles, the cones, if there are cones, and the overall appearance. And then also if you see any evidence of infection, that's really good to document with a photo. After we know where the trees are, we will monitor the populations and the trees and assess them if they have any infections. And if there are infected trees, we might prescribe, as the Forest Service might prescribe some restoration actions, which can include landscape treatments like pruning an infected limb so it doesn't spread to the trunk of the tree. Or reducing the competition. Since we live in a world of fire suppression, we can remove some of those lodgepoles or other competing species to create more suitable habitat for regeneration of trees. And then we can also identify trees that have genetic resistance to this rust. And then we can harvest cones and seeds from those trees and then plant those trees so we can increase that genetic trait in a stand. And fourth, there's a lot of information that we don't know about white pine blister rust and also white bark pine. So continuing research is an ever-going part of land management. And if you want to know more about white bark pine, the Montana PBS had a documentary called Ghost Forests, and then this White Bark Pine Foundation has a ton of more resources to check out. And it looks like I have a question already.
So when I lived in LA, there was like a there was like this for like oak trees. There was like this cicada, or I don't remember. Like it was some sort of bug that like turned into larvae or something, and it like attacked oak trees and that sort of thing. And they had like traps set up for it. How do you? I know you listed like prevention, but like it's a viral disease, it's like a fungus. So like, how do you protect like fungus? Like, I mean, like how does it transmit itself, and then like how do you stop it before it gets too bad?
Yeah, that's, I mean, people are still working on that exact question. We don't necessarily have an answer to it, but it's transmitted through the air. So fungus produce spores, that's their reproductive method. And then the spores go through the air and land on either their primary host or secondary host. So we can't really go and have our trees wear masks like we can with the coronavirus. So stopping the airborne transmission of the fungus, we don't really have a solution for that. So kind of what we go after is treating it once it's in its either canker stage, or a number of years ago, there was a theory that land managers tried to use was if we could get rid of its alternate host, the rabies species, then maybe we could stop its life cycle. But removing every rabies, every current gooseberry in the forest just ended up not being practical. And those species also have their importance. So that's kind of an example of, we try something, we think it might work, and then decide later that that's maybe not the best option, and try something new.
Could there be like an artificial way to like make, I don't know, like like an agent that could kill the host and like leave and not kill the other species of plants?
Could you say that again? Sorry.
Couldn't there be like a way to produce like an agent to exterminate the host?
Well, so the host is the host would be the whitebark pine, which is the species that we're trying to save. But the pest would be the blister rust. And with other fungal pests, there is sometimes we'll use like antifungal type of things, like, which is the same type of thing. If you have like athlete's foot, you'll use an antifungal. But those large landscape scale pesticide applications aren't always the best because they're not targeted for just the invasive fungal species, because we have a lot of fungal species on our forest that are native and important, and a lot of them are actually rare, and we have some fungal species on our forest that we actually manage for, just like the whitebark pine, as a sensitive species.
Any other questions?
Yeah, well, thank you guys so much for coming, letting us come into your classroom and share about our little areas that we are passionate about and have spent our career working on. So